I heard my daughter whisper, "When that old lady finally ends up in a nursing home, we'll have everything," just as the string quartet shifted into a softer melody and the guests lifted their glasses to celebrate her happiness. I didn't turn around. I didn't let my smile falter. I simply adjusted the sleeve of my pale blue dress, the one I had chosen months ago because Emily once told me it made me look elegant, and continued walking across the polished ballroom floor as if I hadn't just heard my own child plan the quiet erasure of my life. The Grand Regency Hall had never looked more beautiful. Every table dressed in ivory linens and fresh peonies flown in from Oregon, the kind Emily had insisted on even though they were out of season and cost nearly 3 times as much. I had agreed without hesitation. I always did. After all, this was my daughter's wedding day, the day she had dreamed about since she was a little girl spinning in the living room, wearing a bedsheet as a veil. I had spent nearly 8 months making sure every detail was perfect, writing checks that made my accountant raise his eyebrows, reviewing contracts, tasting menus, and coordinating with vendors who addressed me as ma'am with polite efficiency, never realizing I was more than just the woman footing the bill. From the outside, it must have looked like a picture-perfect celebration. Guests laughed softly, champagne flutes clinked, and the warm glow of chandeliers reflected off the marble floors. Emily stood near the center of it all, radiant in a custom gown that had taken 3 fittings and a last-minute alteration just a week ago. She looked exactly the way I had always imagined she would on her wedding day. Confident, graceful, admired. And yet, there had been something in her eyes lately. Something I couldn't quite name until now. I paused briefly near one of the tall floral arrangements, pretending to admire the arrangement while steadying my breath. My hands felt strangely cold despite the warmth of the room. Across the hall, I caught a glimpse of Daniel, her fiancé, now husband, leaning in slightly as Emily spoke, his expression shifting into something that resembled quiet amusement. Not surprise, not discomfort, amusement. That, more than anything, settled something deep inside me. Because a stranger might have laughed out of confusion, but Daniel looked like a man who had heard that sentence before. I straightened my posture and resumed walking, greeting a group of distant relatives who complimented the venue, the food, the atmosphere. I thanked them politely, my voice steady, my smile practiced. No one noticed anything unusual. No one ever does in moments like these. The cruelty wasn't loud. It never is. It hides in lowered voices, in words meant to be overheard but never confronted, in the careful balance between denial and intent. As I moved through the room, I found myself remembering a conversation from 3 days earlier, when I hadn't fully understood at the time. An email I wasn't supposed to see. A question Emily had asked her fiancé about timelines and what happens after. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking. That stress made people say odd things. That weddings brought out strange anxieties. But now, standing in a room I had paid for, surrounded by people celebrating a union I had supported without question, I realized something far more unsettling. This wasn't a sudden thought whispered in a careless moment. This was a plan, and I had been standing right at the center of it, smiling, nodding, signing checks, while they quietly mapped out a future that did not include me. I picked up a glass of champagne from a passing server, holding it delicately between my fingers as I turned back toward the dance floor. Emily was laughing now, her head tilted slightly, her veil catching the light as she moved. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect daughter, the perfect bride. And perhaps, in her own mind, she still was. After all, she hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't caused a scene. She had simply whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, as if granting me the courtesy of knowing my place before gently removing me from it. I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the crisp taste settle my thoughts. For years, I had believed that love within a family was something steady, something you could rely on even when everything else shifted. But standing there, in that beautifully decorated hall, I began to understand that love, when mixed with entitlement and quiet calculation, could transform into something else entirely. Something colder, something strategic. I set the glass down on the nearest table and smoothed my hands over the fabric of my dress, pressing out wrinkles that didn't exist. From a distance, I must have looked composed, even proud. And in a way, I was. Just not for the reasons anyone in that room would have assumed. Because while they were celebrating the beginning of their future, I had just caught a glimpse of the one they were planning without me. And the most interesting part wasn't what they had said. It was how certain they were that I would never do anything about it. The music softened as the first dance began, and I found my seat near the edge of the ballroom, close enough to observe but far enough to remain unnoticed, which was exactly where I had learned to exist in Emily's world over the past year, somewhere between necessary and invisible, present but never truly included. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, watching as she rested her head lightly against Daniel's shoulder, her expression soft and serene, as if the words she had whispered earlier did not exist, as if they belonged to someone else entirely, someone colder, someone I had not recognized until now. Around me, guests leaned in toward one another, murmuring about how beautiful the ceremony had been, how perfect the couple looked together, how lucky Emily was to have found someone so successful, so composed, so well-spoken, and I nodded politely whenever someone glanced my way, offering the same practice smile I had worn for most of the afternoon, a smile that concealed far more than it revealed. It was strange how quickly a room full of joy could begin to feel distant, almost like watching a scene through glass. Everything moving in perfect rhythm while I stood slightly removed, aware of details others missed, the subtle way Daniel's hand tightened at Emily's waist when he thought no one was looking, the brief exchange of glances between them that carried meaning beneath the surface, meaning I was only beginning to understand. I reached for the small clutch I carried and ran my fingers along its edge, grounding myself in something tangible as my mind drifted back to that email from 3 days ago, the one that had appeared briefly on the screen of Emily's tablet when she had asked me to check a vendor confirmation, a simple request that should have meant nothing, except it did. I had not meant to read it. I had only glanced, the way anyone would when words are already in front of them. But what I saw lingered in my thoughts long after I closed the screen, a message from a financial advisor, outlining options, timelines, and phrases that felt oddly impersonal when connected to family. Phrases like asset transition and long-term care planning, words that seemed out of place in the middle of wedding preparations. Words that did not belong to a daughter planning a future with her husband, but rather to someone organizing something else entirely. At the time, I told myself it was precaution, that perhaps Daniel had suggested it, that young couples today were simply more practical, more forward-thinking, but standing there now, replaying that moment alongside the whisper I had just heard, the pieces began to settle into a shape that was difficult to ignore. I watched as the dance ended and applause filled the room. Emily stepping back with a graceful smile, lifting her bouquet slightly as if acknowledging an invisible audience beyond the one in front of her. And for a brief moment, our eyes met across the distance. Just a second, maybe less, but long enough for me to see something flicker there. Not guilt, not quite, but awareness. The quiet recognition that I had heard what I was not meant to respond to. She looked away first, turning back toward Daniel as he leaned in to say something that made her laugh softly, the sound blending seamlessly with the music, as if it belonged to the celebration, as if nothing beneath the surface had shifted at all. A server passed by offering another round of drinks, and I declined with a gentle shake of my head, my attention drawn instead to the table arrangements I had spent weeks perfecting, each place setting aligned, each name card written in careful script, details I once believed mattered because they created a sense of warmth, of belonging, but now seemed almost symbolic of something else, a performance of unity rather than its reality. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing myself to observe without interruption, to listen without reacting, because that was what this required now, not confrontation, not emotion, but clarity, the kind that comes when you stop explaining things away and begin to see them exactly as they are. For years, I had dismissed small changes as natural distance, as independence, as the inevitable shift that happens when children build lives of their own. But there was a difference between distance and design, between growing apart and being quietly positioned out of place, and the realization settled over me not with shock, but with a calm, steady certainty that felt almost unfamiliar in its clarity. I smoothed the fabric of my dress once more and adjusted the bracelet on my wrist, a simple gold piece Emily had given me years ago, back when gestures still carried meaning without conditions, and I wondered briefly when that had changed, when kindness had begun to coexist with calculation, when love had become something that could be measured, planned around, and eventually replaced. Across the room, Emily and Daniel were being pulled into conversations, laughter rising around them as guests gathered close, drawn to their energy, their future, their promise, and I realized then that whatever they had planned, whatever they believed would happen next, they were certain of it, certain enough to speak it out loud, certain enough to assume I would accept it without question, without resistance, without even acknowledgement. I let out a slow breath, steady and controlled, and rested my hands again in my lap. The picture of composure, the woman everyone expected me to be, the one who supported, who provided, who stepped back when necessary. But beneath that surface, something had shifted quietly into place, not anger, not even sadness, but awareness, the kind that does not demand immediate action, only patience, only observation. Because the most revealing moments are rarely the loud ones. They're the ones where people believe they are no longer being watched. The speeches began shortly after dinner was served, and I listened carefully as one by one, familiar voices stepped forward to celebrate Emily and Daniel. Each story polished, each memory softened into something bright and easy to share, the kind of words that fill a room without ever revealing what sits just beneath the surface. And I found myself wondering how many of them truly knew her anymore, or if they, like me, had been holding on to a version of Emily that no longer existed. I sat still, hands folded, posture straight, the perfect image of a proud mother, as Daniel's best man spoke about loyalty and trust, about building a future together on a foundation of honesty, and I almost admired the irony of it, the way those words floated through the room, so effortlessly, untouched by the quiet truths that had already begun to unravel behind them. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he took the microphone with a calm confidence that had always impressed people, his voice steady, his smile measured, the kind of man who knew exactly how to present himself. And he spoke about Emily with admiration, calling her thoughtful, devoted, and kind, pausing just long enough at each word to let it settle, as if he believed saying it slowly would make it more real. I watched him closely, not for what he said, but for what he did not say, for the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his eyes moved across the room, never quite landing on me for more than a second. And it struck me then that avoidance is often more revealing than confrontation, that what people choose not to face can tell you far more than what they openly acknowledge. Emily followed, radiant and composed, thanking everyone for being there, her voice soft but clear, the same voice that used to call me late at night, just to talk, to share small details about her day, moments that once felt meaningful and now seemed distant, almost unreal, like memories from someone else's life. She thanked me too, of course, with just enough warmth to satisfy the room, mentioning my support, my help with the wedding, the way I had always been there for her, and the guests responded with approving smiles, a few glances in my direction, as if to confirm that yes, I was the devoted mother she described, and I nodded gently in return, accepting their silent acknowledgement, while understanding how little of it reflected what had quietly shifted over time. As she spoke, I found myself remembering another moment from that same week, something small that had felt insignificant at the time, but now returned with a sharper clarity, a phone call I had received from my bank regarding a routine review, the kind they conduct every few years, and the representative had asked if I intended to make any changes to my estate planning in light of recent activity, a question that had puzzled me then because I had made no such inquiries, no recent adjustments, no discussion that would prompt that kind of attention. I had dismissed it politely, assuming it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error, something that did not require further thought. But standing there now, listening to Emily's carefully crafted gratitude, I realized that perhaps the conversation had not been initiated by me at all. Perhaps someone else had been asking questions on my behalf, exploring options, testing possibilities, all while presenting themselves as concerned, as responsible, as forward-thinking. The applause that followed her speech was warm and generous, filling the room with a sense of unity that felt almost convincing if you did not look too closely. And I joined in, my hands moving in quiet rhythm with everyone else, the sound blending seamlessly into the celebration, as if I were fully part of it, as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface. Emily stepped down from the stage and moved toward Daniel, their hands finding each other with practiced ease. And for a moment, they stood together at the center of the room, surrounded by admiration, by expectation, by the future they believed they were building, and I watched them not with resentment, not with anger, but with a clarity that felt almost detached, as if I were seeing them for the first time without the filter of assumption or hope. It is a strange thing to realize that the people you have loved the longest may not be the people you thought they were, not because they changed suddenly, but because you finally stopped overlooking the details that never quite fit. I adjusted the bracelet on my wrist again, the small, familiar movement grounding me as I considered everything I'd seen, everything I had heard, and everything I had previously chosen to ignore, and I understood then that what had once felt like isolated moments, like misunderstandings or coincidences, were in fact part of something more deliberate, something carefully constructed over time. The music began again, signaling the next part of the evening, and guests slowly returned to their conversations, their laughter, their glasses raised in quiet celebration, unaware of the shift that had taken place within me, unaware that while they were witnessing the beginning of a marriage, I had just reached the end of certain kind of trust. I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the noise of the room to settle around me. And then I stood, smoothing the front of my dress, lifting my chin slightly as I stepped back into the flow of the evening. Not as someone who had been diminished, not as someone who had been quietly dismissed, but as someone who had finally begun to understand the shape of what was unfolding, and more importantly, the role I would choose to play in what came next. The evening carried on with the smooth precision of an event that had been planned down to the smallest detail, and I moved through it exactly as expected, greeting guests, exchanging polite conversations, and offering the kind of quiet presence that people often associate with grace, the kind that does not draw attention but is always noticed when it is absent. And I realized as I spoke with each person that I had spent years perfecting this role, without ever questioning who had assigned it to me in the first place. A distant cousin approached me near the dessert table, complimenting the arrangement, the music, the overall atmosphere, and I thanked her with a soft smile, listening as she spoke about how lucky Emily was to have such a devoted mother, how rare it was to see someone give so much without expecting anything in return, and I nodded as if that were still true, as if the quiet assumptions people made about me had not begun to shift in ways they could not see. I excused myself shortly after and stepped into a quieter hallway just outside the ballroom, the sound of laughter and music softening behind me as the doors closed, leaving me in a space that felt almost still by comparison, a place where I could think without the constant movement of the celebration pressing in from all sides. The hallway was lined with tall windows, and I paused near one of them, looking out at the city lights stretching across the distance, steady and unchanged, a reminder that not everything shifts just because something inside you does. I rested my hand lightly against the cool glass and allowed myself, for the first time that evening, to revisit the past without interruption, not the distant past of Emily's childhood, but the more recent months, the ones I had moved through without truly examining, moments that now felt sharper, more defined, as if they had been waiting for this exact clarity to be understood. There was the afternoon she insisted on handling the guest list without my input, brushing off my suggestions with a polite but firm tone that left no room for discussion, something I had accepted at the time as independence, as a natural desire to take control of her own wedding, but now seemed more like a quiet boundary being drawn, a subtle repositioning of roles that I had not fully recognized. There was the conversation about the house, the one I had owned for over 30 years, where she casually mentioned how large it felt, how difficult it must be to maintain alone, her voice carrying a kind of concern that sounded thoughtful on the surface, but felt rehearsed when I looked back on it now, as if she had been testing a reaction rather than expressing genuine worry. I had laughed it off then, assuring her that I managed just fine, that I knew every corner of that house, every creak in the floorboards, every detail that made it mine, and she had smiled in return, but there had been something behind that smile, something that did not quite match the words she was saying. And then there was Daniel, always respectful, always measured, the kind of man who knew how to present himself well in any situation, but who rarely engaged in conversations that went beyond the surface, who listened more than he spoke, who observed carefully. And I began to realize that his silence had never been passive. It had been deliberate, the kind that gathers information rather than shares it. I exhaled slowly, the pieces aligning in a way that no longer required interpretation. Because once you see a pattern clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee it, and I understood now that what I had once considered small, isolated moments were in fact connected, part of a larger structure that had been forming quietly over time, one that positioned me not at the center of a family, but gradually at its edge. I straightened my posture and adjusted the bracelet on my wrist again, the familiar movement grounding me as I stepped away from the window, my reflection briefly visible in the glass, composed, steady, unchanged on the surface, and I realized that appearances can remain perfectly intact, even when everything beneath them has shifted completely. When I returned to the ballroom, the energy had shifted slightly, the formalities giving way to a more relaxed atmosphere, guests mingling more freely, laughter rising a little louder, the kind of transition that signals the later part of an evening when people begin to settle into comfort, into familiarity, into the assumption that everything important has already happened. Emily stood near the center again, surrounded by friends, her posture relaxed, her expression bright. And for a moment, I watched her not as a mother seeing her daughter, but as someone observing a person whose intentions had only just come into focus. And it was a different kind of seeing entirely, one that did not rely on memory or expectation, but on what was present, what was real, what had been revealed in quiet fragments throughout the night. She caught sight of me briefly and offered a small wave, a gesture that would have felt warm once, but now seemed measured, almost calculated in its simplicity, and I returned it with the same calm composure I had maintained all evening, because there was no need to react differently, no need to signal that anything had changed, not yet. I moved toward a nearby table and rested my fingertips lightly against its surface, grounding myself once more as I considered what came next. Not in terms of confrontation or immediate action, but in terms of understanding, because the most effective decisions are rarely made in moments of emotion. They're made in moments of clarity, when everything is seen without distortion, without denial, without the need to soften what is uncomfortable. Around me, the celebration continued exactly as it should, untouched by the quiet shift that had taken place within me, and I realized that this was the advantage of being underestimated, of being seen as someone who would accept things as they are, who would not question, who would not resist, because it allows you the space to observe without interference, to understand without interruption, and most importantly, to decide your next move without anyone realizing that a decision has already been made. It was not until later in the evening, when most of the formalities had dissolved into quiet conversations and soft music, that someone finally spoke to me without the careful polish that had defined every other interaction that day, and it came from a voice I recognized immediately, steady, familiar, and unfiltered way that stood in sharp contrast to everything else around me. "Margaret," Linda said gently as she approached, her expression warm but her eyes carrying a weight that did not belong to celebration, and I turned toward her with a small, genuine smile, one of the few I had allowed myself that evening. Linda had known me for over 20 years, long enough to recognize the difference between composure and silence, long enough to understand when something had shifted even if no words had been spoken yet. She stood beside me rather than in front of me, her posture relaxed, her tone casual, as if we were simply observing the room together, but there was intention in her presence, a quiet awareness that made it clear she had not come over by chance. "It is beautiful," she said, glancing toward the dance floor where Emily and Daniel were surrounded by friends, laughter rising easily among them, and I nodded, following her gaze for a moment before responding. "Yes, it is I replied softly, my voice even controlled, giving nothing away, and for a few seconds we stood there in silence, the kind that feels natural between people who do not need to fill every space with words. Then, without turning her head, Linda spoke again, her voice lower this time, steady but deliberate. "You might want to take a closer look at your paperwork when you get home," she said, as if she were commenting on something ordinary, something routine, and I felt the weight of her words settle slowly rather than all at once, because it was not what she said, but how she said it. Not a suggestion, not a question, but a quiet certainty. I turned my head slightly toward her, not enough to draw attention, just enough to meet her eyes, and what I saw there confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that this was not speculation, not concern without reason, but information, something she knew rather than something she feared. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, my tone calm, almost neutral, the way one might respond to a passing comment, and she exhaled softly before answering, her gaze still directed toward the room rather than at me. "Anything that has your name on it," she said, her voice steady, "especially anything related to your house, your accounts, your estate." There was no urgency in her tone, no alarm, and that made it all the more unsettling, because urgency can be dismissed as emotion, but calm certainty rarely can. I felt my fingers tighten slightly against the edge of the table beside me, a subtle movement that no one else would notice, but one that grounded me in the moment as I processed what she was saying, how it connected to everything I'd already seen, everything I'd already heard. "Did something happen?" I asked, keeping my voice measured, careful, and this time she turned her head just enough to meet my eyes fully, her expression unchanged but her gaze direct. "I heard a conversation earlier this week," she said quietly. "Not meant for me, I am sure, but clear enough to understand." She paused for a brief moment, as if choosing her next words carefully, and then continued. "They were asking questions, Margaret. Not general ones, specific ones. About timelines, about authority, about what could be changed and when." The music in the background seemed to fade slightly, not because it had actually grown quieter, but because my focus had shifted entirely to what she was saying, to the confirmation of something I had only begun to piece together on my own. "Who was asking?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, and she did not hesitate. "Emily," she said simply, and then after a brief pause, "and Daniel was there." I let that settle, not reacting outwardly, not allowing anything to surface that might be noticed by the people moving around us, laughing, celebrating, unaware of the quiet shift taking place just a few feet away. They were not concerned, Linda continued, her voice still calm. They were planning. The word lingered in the air between us, heavy in its simplicity, because planning implies intention, and intention removes any possibility of misunderstanding. I nodded once, slowly, acknowledging what she had said without needing further explanation, because there was nothing unclear about it anymore, no room left for doubt or reinterpretation. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice steady, and she gave a small nod in return, her role in the conversation complete, her presence never drawing attention, never disrupting the flow of the evening. "Just be careful," she added softly before stepping away, blending back into the crowd as seamlessly as she had arrived, leaving me standing there with a clarity that no longer felt unsettling, but precise. I remained where I was for a moment, my gaze returning to the center of the room where Emily stood, her laughter light, her movements effortless, her future unfolding exactly as she expected, and I realized that what had changed was not the situation itself, but my understanding of it, the removal of uncertainty, the confirmation of intention, and with that came something else, something quieter but far more important, the ability to act without hesitation when the time came. I smoothed my hands over the fabric of my dress once more, adjusting nothing, simply maintaining the appearance of calm, because there was no need to do anything differently, not here, not now, not in a room where everyone believed they understood the roles being played. And perhaps that was the most important realization of all, that while they were certain of their plan, they were equally certain of me, certain that I would remain exactly as I had always been, supportive, unaware, and silent, and that certainty, more than anything else, was the one thing they had miscalculated. By the time the evening began to wind down, I had already decided that nothing I would do next would happen in that room. Not in front of an audience that was too invested in appearances to recognize what truly mattered, and certainly not in a way that would give Emily or Daniel the satisfaction of seeing me react to something they believed I did not fully understand. I remained exactly as I had been all night, composed, attentive, present in all the ways expected of me, offering congratulations, exchanging farewells, and watching as guests slowly gathered their belongings, their laughter softening into polite goodbyes as the celebration drew to its natural close. When Emily finally approached me, her expression warm, her tone light, she wrapped her arms around me in a brief embrace that felt practiced rather than spontaneous, the kind of gesture that fulfills an expectation rather than expresses a feeling. "Thank you for everything, Mom," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough sincerity to sound convincing, and I returned the embrace with the same measured calm I had maintained all evening, my hand resting lightly against her back, my expression gentle, unchanged. "It was a beautiful wedding," I replied, my voice steady, giving her exactly what she expected to. "Here, nothing more, nothing less." She pulled back slightly, studying my face for a moment, as if searching for something, perhaps a reaction, perhaps a sign that I had heard more than I should have, but I offered none, only the same composed smile, the same quiet presence that had allowed her to underestimate me for so long. Daniel joined her a moment later, offering his own thanks, his tone polite, his posture relaxed, and I nodded in acknowledgement, observing him with the same calm detachment that had settled over me hours earlier, recognizing now that his confidence was not based on certainty of outcome, but on certainty of perception, the belief that I would remain predictable, that I would follow the same pattern I always had. "We will come by next week," Emily added casually, as if it were already decided, as if my time, my space, my home were still part of something she could arrange without question, and I nodded once, not committing, not refusing, simply allowing the statement to exist without response because there was no need to clarify anything tonight. "Drive safely," I said instead, my voice even, and with that, the exchange was complete, the roles maintained, the expectations fulfilled. I left shortly after, stepping out into the cool night air, where the quiet felt almost deliberate, a contrast to the carefully managed noise inside. And as I walked toward my car, the events of the evening settled into place with a clarity that no longer required effort to maintain. The city lights stretched ahead of me as I drove home, steady and familiar, the roads nearly empty at that hour, giving me the space to think without interruption, to move through each detail without distraction. And I found that my thoughts were not scattered, not overwhelmed, but organized, precise, as if everything had already aligned the moment I allowed myself to see it clearly. When I arrived at the house, I paused briefly before unlocking the door, taking in the quiet of the space that had always been mine, a place built over decades, filled with memories that had once felt shared but now belonged solely to me. And I stepped inside with a sense of awareness that was different from anything I had felt before, not emotional, not reactive, but intentional. I set my keys down in their usual place, removed my shoes, and moved through the familiar rooms with a calm that bordered on stillness, noticing small details I had overlooked for years, the way the light from the street filtered through the curtains, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the quiet creak of the floorboards beneath my steps, each sound grounding me further in the present moment. I did not turn on the television. I did not distract myself with routine. Instead, I walked directly to my study and sat at the desk where I had signed countless documents over the years, documents I had trusted without question, decisions I had made with the assumption that the people closest to me would always act in good faith, and I realized then that trust, once unquestioned, requires a different kind of attention once it is broken, not to repair it, but to understand exactly where and how it shifted. I opened the drawer and retrieved a small stack of folders, the ones that contained everything Linda had indirectly referred to, my accounts, my property records, my estate planning documents, and I placed them neatly in front of me, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with purpose. I had no intention of rushing through them that night, No need to react impulsively because the situation did not require speed, it required accuracy, clarity, and most importantly, control. I rested my hands lightly on the surface of the desk and allowed myself a moment of stillness before beginning, understanding now that what mattered was not what had already been said or done, but what would happen next, and that for the first time in a very long time, that decision would not be shaped by expectation, by habit, or by assumption, but by something far more deliberate. Because while they had been planning quietly, believing I would remain unaware, I had been listening, observing, and now, finally, I was ready to act in a way they would never see coming. I did not open the documents immediately, not because I was hesitant, but because I understood that once I began, I would need to be fully present, fully focused, and not influenced by the quiet echoes of the evening that still lingered in my mind. So instead, I sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence of the house settle around me until it felt complete, uninterrupted, entirely. Mine. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second marking a shift that had already taken place, and I realized that time itself had not betrayed me. Only the assumptions I had attached to it, the belief that what had always been would continue without question. I reached for the first folder and opened it carefully, not rushing, not skimming, but reading each page with deliberate attention, the kind that comes not from urgency, but from clarity. The numbers were familiar, the structure unchanged, accounts I had maintained for years, investments I had built slowly, methodically, always with the intention of stability rather than excess. And yet as I moved through the pages, something subtle began to emerge. Not an obvious error, not a dramatic alteration, but a pattern, small annotations, recent inquiries, requests for information that I did not remember making. I paused briefly, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper as I considered what I was seeing, not with confusion, but with recognition, because it aligned too precisely with everything I had already been told, everything I had already observed. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my recent communications, not searching for anything specific, but confirming what I already suspected, that there were no records of me initiating these discussions, no emails, no calls, nothing that would justify the activity reflected in the documents before me. That absence, more than anything else, confirmed the presence of something deliberate. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the realization to settle fully, not resisting it, not softening it, simply accepting it for exactly what it was. They had not acted impulsively. They had not made a careless mistake. They had taken steps, quiet ones, measured ones, believing that I would either not notice or not question them if I did. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the desk, not because I was finished, but because I had seen enough for the moment, enough to understand the direction, enough to confirm the intent. There was no need to continue late into the night, no need to overwhelm myself with details when a larger picture was already clear. What mattered now was not gathering more information, but deciding how to respond to what I already knew. I stood and walked slowly through the house, turning off lights as I moved, each room dimming one by one until only the soft glow from the hallway remained, casting long, quiet shadows that felt more honest than the brightness of the ballroom had been. When I reached my bedroom, I paused at the doorway, looking at the space not as something shared in memory, but as something entirely mine in the present. And that distinction, though subtle, carried a weight that felt both grounding and final. I changed into something more comfortable and sat briefly at the edge of the bed, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my thoughts no longer circling, no longer searching for explanations, because there were none left to find. There was only what had been revealed, what had been confirmed, and what would come next. I lay down and turned off the lamp beside me, the room settling into darkness as the events of the day replayed, not with intensity, but with precision, each moment aligning with the next in a way that required no interpretation, no questioning. The whisper, the glance, the conversation Linda had overheard, the documents now resting on my desk, all of it connected, all of it part of something that had been unfolding quietly, patiently, without drawing attention. And yet, what stood out most was not what they had done, but what they believed about me, that I would remain unchanged, that I would continue to move through life as I always had, trusting, accommodating, unquestioning. That belief, more than anything else, was where they had made their mistake. Because understanding does not require noise. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, settles deeply, and once it does, it changes everything that follows. I close my eyes, not to escape the thoughts, but to let them settle into something stable, something clear, because the next steps would not be made in reaction, not in anger, not in haste, but in a way that required patience, precision, and complete control. And as the house grew still around me, I understood that while they had spent time preparing for a future they believed was inevitable, they had never considered that I might be preparing for something of my own. Morning arrived without urgency, the light filtering gently through the curtains as if nothing had shifted, as if the world outside continued on its usual course, untouched by the quiet decisions that had already begun to take shape within me. And I rose at the same time I always did, following the same routine, making coffee, opening the windows slightly to let in the cool air, moving through the kitchen with a familiarity that felt steady rather than comforting, because comfort was no longer what I was seeking, only clarity. I sat at the table with my cup in hand and allowed the silence to remain uninterrupted, not reaching for the television, not checking messages, not filling the space with distractions, because what needed to be done required attention, not avoidance. After a few minutes, I stood and returned to the study, the folders still exactly where I had left them the night before, undisturbed, waiting, and I took my seat with the same calm intention that had settled in me before I went to bed, knowing that this was no longer about discovery, but about direction. I opened the documents again, this time moving more efficiently, not reading for understanding, but confirming what I already knew, tracing the small adjustments, the inquiries, the subtle movements that pointed toward a single conclusion. And once I had seen enough, I closed the folder and reached for my phone, scrolling to a contact I had not needed to call in years, not because the connection was lost, but because there had never been a reason to use it. "Good morning, Jonathan," I said when the call was answered, my voice steady, clear, leaving no room for hesitation, and there was a brief pause on the other end before his tone shifted into recognition. Jonathan Hale had been my attorney for over 2 decades, a man who understood not only the structure of my finances, but the reasoning behind them, someone who did not ask unnecessary questions, but always listened carefully when something required attention. "Margaret," he replied, his voice professional but warm, "it has been a while." "Yes," I said simply, "and I believe it is time we review everything." There is no need to explain further, no need to justify the request, because he understood immediately the subtle shift in tone, the absence of casual conversation, the precision of my words. "Of course," he said, "I have availability this afternoon if that works for you." "It does," I replied, and we finalized the time without further discussion, the call ending as efficiently as it had begun. I set the phone down and allowed myself a brief moment of stillness, not because I needed to gather my thoughts, but because I recognized that this was the point where observation shifted into action, where understanding became something tangible, something structured. The rest of the morning passed quietly, each movement deliberate, each task completed without distraction. And when the time came, I prepared to leave with the same composure I had carried through the previous evening, choosing a simple outfit, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything out of the ordinary, because there was no need for outward change when everything important was happening beneath the surface. Jonathan's office was exactly as I remembered it, orderly, understated, a space designed for clarity rather than comfort. And when I stepped inside, he greeted me with a firm handshake and a measured nod, the kind that acknowledges both familiarity and purpose. "Let us take a look," he said, gesturing toward the desk, and I placed the folders in front of him, not with urgency, but with certainty, allowing him to review them at his own pace while I sat across from him, hands resting calmly in my lap, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral. He moved through the documents methodically, his eyes scanning each page with the kind of precision that comes from years of experience, and I watched without interrupting, without asking questions, because I already knew what he would find, what he would confirm, and after several minutes, he set the papers down and leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, but not surprised. "There have been inquiries," he said carefully, choosing his words with the same precision I had come to expect from him. "Requests for information, preliminary discussions about restructuring certain assets." I nodded once, acknowledging what he had said without needing further clarification, and he continued. "Nothing has been changed yet, but there have been attempts to explore what could be done under certain conditions." Under certain conditions. The phrase settled into place easily, aligning with everything I had already understood, and I met his gaze steadily. "I would like to ensure that those conditions are no longer possible," I said, my voice calm, controlled, leaving no ambiguity in my intent. He held my gaze for a moment, assessing, not questioning, and then nodded once. "That can be arranged," he replied, and with that, the conversation moved forward, not into speculation, not into emotion, but into action, precise, deliberate, and entirely within my control. As he began outlining the necessary steps, the adjustments, the protections that would need to be put in place, I listened carefully, absorbing each detail, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, but focused, because this was no longer about what had been planned for me, but about what I would now decide for myself. And for the first time since the whisper that had changed everything, I felt something settle into place with complete certainty, not doubt, not hesitation, but direction. The changes did not take long to put into place, not because they were simple, but because they were precise, and precision, when handled correctly, does not require excess time, only clear intention and the willingness to follow through without hesitation. I left Jonathan's office with a folder that looked no different from the one I brought in, yet everything inside it had shifted in a way that could not be undone without my direct consent. And that distinction, though invisible to anyone else, carried more weight than any outward display ever could. The drive home felt quieter than the night before, not because there was less to consider, but because the uncertainty had been removed, replaced by a structure that no longer depended on assumption or trust, only on what had been formally established, documented, and secured. When I arrived, the house greeted me with the same stillness it always had, but this time it felt different in a way that was difficult to describe. Not changed, not unfamiliar, but reaffirmed, as if something that had been subtly questioned was now fully returned to its rightful place. I set the folder down in my study and did not open it again because there was no need to review what had already been decided, no need to revisit something that was already complete. Instead, I moved through the rest of the afternoon with a quiet sense of order, preparing a simple meal, watering the plants, completing small tasks that had nothing to do with the events of the past 24 hours, yet felt more intentional than they had in years, because they were no longer accompanied by the underlying expectation that someone else would eventually take over, adjust, or influence what belonged to me. Later that evening, my phone rang, and I knew before I answered who it would be, not because I had been waiting, but because patterns, once recognized, tend to repeat themselves with a certain predictability. "Mom," Emily's voice came through, light, casual, carrying the same tone she had used the night before, as if nothing had shifted, as if the conversation we were about to have existed in the same space as all the others we had shared over the years. "We were thinking about coming by tomorrow," she said, her words framed as a suggestion, but delivered with the quiet certainty of expectation, and I allowed a brief pause before responding, not to create tension, but to ensure that my answer was exactly what I intended it to be. "Tomorrow will not be a good day," I said calmly, my voice even, offering no additional explanation, no apology, no adjustment, and there was a slight hesitation on the other end of the line, just long enough to be noticeable. "Oh," she replied, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "Well, maybe later this week then?" The question hung there, waiting, but I did not fill the space with anything more than what was necessary. "I will let you know when I am available," I said, maintaining the same steady cadence. And this time, the pause was longer, not confusion, but recalibration, the subtle recognition that something had changed, even if she could not yet define what it was. "Okay," she said finally, her voice softer now, less certain, and we ended the call shortly after, the conversation brief, contained, entirely different from the ones we had once had, where decisions flowed in one direction without question. I set the phone down and stood quietly for a moment, not reflecting, not analyzing, simply acknowledging the shift that had just taken place, because it was not in the documents, not in the legal structures, but in the dynamic itself, the unspoken understanding that access was no longer assumed, that presence was no longer guaranteed, that what had once been open without condition was now defined by something else entirely. Over the next few days, I maintained that same approach, responding when necessary, but never immediately, speaking when appropriate, but never excessively, allowing space where there had once been constant availability, and with each interaction, I could feel the adjustment on the other side, the uncertainty growing, the assumptions beginning to unravel in ways that no direct confrontation could have achieved. There were no arguments, no raised voices, no dramatic declarations, only a quiet, consistent shift that redefined everything without ever announcing itself. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room with a book resting open in my hands, I realized that the house felt different again, not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight of expectation had been removed, leaving behind something far more stable, far more intentional. I closed the book and looked out the window, the same view I had seen for years, unchanged, steady, familiar, and I understood then that what had ended was not a relationship in the traditional sense, not something that could be pointed to or named, but a version of it, one built on assumptions that no longer held true. They had been waiting for a moment that would never come, planning for an outcome that no longer existed, and the most significant part of it all was that they would not realize it immediately, not in a single moment of clarity, but gradually, as each expectation failed to align with reality, as each assumption met a boundary it had never encountered before. I stood and adjusted the bracelet on my wrist, the same small movement I had made so many times before, but this time it felt different, not a gesture of habit, but one of quiet certainty. And as I turned away for the window, I understood something with complete clarity, something that did not require explanation or confirmation, only acceptance that while they had been preparing for my absence, I had already redefined my presence in a way they would never be able to control.